All right, so we should be able to finish out the last segment here, talking about the developments in the Western Hemisphere throughout the 19th century. Last time, the end of last segment, I was talking about how the self-made man was kind of a cornerstone to Jacksonianism itself, and how, in many cases, Andrew Jackson was the embodiment of a sense of populism within the American electorate, specifically white male electorate during that period of time, and how this was reflected in the self-made man philosophy that began to express itself in the 1830s and 1840s and move forward. What's interesting about all of that is that really by the 1840s, the United States socio-political landscape experiences what's often described as its first age of reform. So what happens here is that the self-made man philosophy begins to expand and kind of ripple throughout American society as a whole, so that there are kind of growing number of voices that are calling for kind of a self-made woman philosophy, or the empowerment of African American interests and rights within the United States during this period of time, an abolitionist movement, a cessation to the westward expansion of slavery itself. So America is beginning to uh, converge in that crossroads between being a free society, but not free for everyone, and how slavery could and whether it should continue to exist in a nation which prides itself on liberty, notions of liberty itself. So the self-made man philosophy, although it's initially kind of intended for and focused on the advancement of white male interests, it is going to, in many cases, begin to have consequences that extend well beyond it. Much like the kind of French Revolution and its sentiments, its ideologies had across Europe throughout the same period of time, the 19th century. By 1830, with regard to African Americans, you had some 2 million slaves living in bondage in the United States, but there were also it was a freed black population as well. Interestingly, there were about 130,000 freed blacks living in northern states, but there were also 180,000 freed blacks living in the South as well. I mention that because it gives us an understanding as far as the complexities and the dynamics that are increasingly a part of uh, reform movements, and often the attainment of rights by minority groups within the United States social tapestry itself. Um, so you had not only the calls for the abolition of slavery, but also freed blacks that wanted to, you know, um, uh, achieve the same kinds of standards and live by the same codes, you might say, as white Americans in many respects, be able to attain and be self-made in their own respect as well, as far as their fulfillment of their own ambitions. Added to this, in addition to kind of the freed black versus enslaved debate, was also the notion that in the upper South, basically in the states of places like slave states such as Virginia, the border states of Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, um, Missouri, but also North Carolina and Tennessee. These areas where slavery was legal, uh, most of the freed blacks in those states lived in rural areas. In the lower South, basically Dixie and South Carolina and Point South, basically, in those slave states, the freed black population lived in mostly urban centers, Atlanta among others, or New Orleans or what have you. Eh, I mention that because when we talk about reform movements themselves, there's going to be a rural, excuse me, a rural versus urban component, and oftentimes rural populations are going to have a very different kind of interests or set of perspectives or a very different agenda than those of urban environments. I mentioned that at the outset with regard to kind of the agrarian versus the industrial workers um, plight at the end of the 19th century, and how this was an anomaly because of these interests were fused together to form the heart of the Populist Party itself. Well, take that and apply it in a kind of micro context with regard to reform movements and initiatives taken within special interest groups like the African American community. That this urban rural divide is going to kind of offer up certain challenges within the movement itself in many cases, and this would be fully exhibited, you could argue, in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and the mid 20th century, with the likes of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, among others. There's this rural urban kind of element to it. Um, I mention that because uh, when we talk about reform movements, social reform movements, racial equality, or gender equality, oftentimes um, the context and the nuance is lost by simply offering up a dichotomous view of those that are pro-reform and those that are adamantly opposed to any type of change to the status quo. Within the reform movements themselves, there is a, a collection of different ideas that are being debated, hotly contested in some cases, and oftentimes this would be to the detriment of the movement itself. I mean, that many times reform movements could potentially collapse in on themselves because there was no consensus across the different perspectives being voiced or wanting to have a space within the reform movement itself. And that's not just the case for American history, that's the case for world history as a whole. I mean, that reform efforts are often difficult to achieve because they have to, in many cases, um, perceive of the same issues and problems and minimize their own interpretations for to kind of coalesce around a greater sense of unity. Um, and then once achieved, then they begin to branch out and want to achieve their own special kinds of ends, which makes reform efforts difficult to galvanize and then implement, and then once implemented, retain those advancements and achievements. The industrialization of the early 19th century, we begin to see the United States begin the process of maintaining um, momentum, or even trying to stay in the same kind of neighborhood, you might say, with regard to industrialization, specifically the industrialization of European powers. Oftentimes, the United States would resort to industrial espionage in order to bring technology, blueprints, and other types of technological developments from areas of Europe to the United States that they could copy and replicate for themselves. Things like steam power not only led to the construction of railroads across the United States, but it also was used to power steamboats that would now traverse the all important Mississippi River, which meant that the river itself was now navigable in both directions, north and south, which made for greater economic opportunities and exploitation of, the resources in the heartland of the United States, whether it be agricultural products or mining, or whatever commerce would be moved into up and down the river itself. With regard to railroads, to give you some figures here, in 1830, the United States had about 100 miles of track. Just 30 years later, by 1860, the eve of the Civil War, the United States had some 27,000 miles of railroad track. 22,000 miles of that total were located in northern states. So that right there should convey that the United States was beginning to industrialize, but it was industrializing most heavily in the North as opposed to the agrarian South. And that was going to add additional fuel to the fire when it came to sectionalism within the United States, primarily Northern, Southern, and developing Western interests. Because of that type of growth that was taking place and economic opportunity, the United States became a magnet for immigration. That many people from Europe and elsewhere saw the United States as a land of opportunity and possibility, opportunities for work and personal advancement. They also wanted to get away from insecurity, war-torn Europe during the Napoleonic era. Um, the you know the civil strife during the 1848 revolutions, the emergence of a unified Germany and what that might portend. But they also wanted to get away from things like food insecurity and famine that would eventually or could potentially erupt as a result of the political instability and the military campaigning that was going on. So as a result, in the early 19th century, immigrants mostly came from northern and western parts of Europe, basically England, Scandinavia, France, Ireland. Um, by the late 19th century, the immigration uh, begins to pivot as far as demographics to mostly come from places like southeastern Europe, the Balkan region, Greece, Italy, and also by the 1880s, largely as a result of needing to import workers to build the intercontinental railroad, um, we see an influx of Chinese immigrants um, being used to work in that capacity as well. So here we see again kind of a multicultural element beginning to take root in the United States here. Um, where notions of identity are beginning to shift. That there is instead of from northwestern Europe, you have largely kind of Protestant um, populations coming to the United States. Again, Ireland would be an exception to that, a primarily Catholic country. But then also, as they move to the southeast, as populations from Greece or from the Balkans or from Italy begin to come to the United States towards the close of the 19th century. This means, again, that there's going to be a different cultural shift, not only Catholic and Orthodox Christian, but also different languages, different diets, different observances in general. Um, and of course, with the influx of Chinese immigrants, again during the m- later decades of the 19th century as well. I mean, that's going to bring its own kind of cultural identity with it. So immigration here is again not just simply a an event in the United States. It is emblematic of large shifts in the world's populations themselves. Where China was increasingly um, uh, defunct as a state and its ability to project its own political authority, as we discussed in the last lecture. Again, Chinese people are going to begin to move elsewhere in order to try and make a better life for themselves. And the United States, in many cases, kind of offered that opportunity. Same goes for Europeans, wherever they come from across Europe, and of course elsewhere around the world, even today. Oftentimes people don't look to uproot themselves. I mean, conditions have to get pretty bad in order for people to uh, abandon their life, the life as they know it, and the life that they've known their entire lives, and either one, start all over again in a brand new part of the world, in a brand new society and culture, new political models, a new economy, new ways of life. That's not easy to do at any age. It's easier for the young to achieve it, but it's often up to parents in order to relocate. At least during this period of time, to relocate and to take that initial first step. Um, so it's a human reality of the human condition that people are on the move and perpetually on the move. And so in the modern debate that's taking place in the often kind of cantankerous and in some cases, violent images that we see surrounding the debate of immigration, again, xenophobia and all the rest of it. That is characteristic of a human history, of an American history as well. Um, but America, time and again, has shown that it is it's prided itself in many respects on the opportunities that it can present to much of the world's population, and that you know is a very strong argument to be made that this country is able to um, help those coming to the country, but then also in many cases fulfill the aspirations of those that are coming to this country. I mean, that indeed through things like hard work, merit, um, you know, uh, self ambition, and on and so forth, that people can make a way for themselves, which is oftentimes the exception in the human experience rather than the norm. What I'll do is I'm going to again save the aspects and developments of the Gilded Age for talking about um, where they talk about the influx of immigration. Um, they cover that in the documentary, so I'm going to kind of defer to that as far as the details are concerned. I do want to finish out the remainder of this time, if I can get through the rest of it in about 10 minutes, focusing on slavery and the post-war era in the United States. So, of course, slavery had been an issue since the founding of the country. The Constitution, while it never states or uses the term slavery itself until the 13th Amendment, the body of the Constitution instead did um, imply slavery by the what's known as the three-fifths clause, in which three uh, slaves counted as three-fifths of a person towards a state's overall population in slaveholding states, which is going to boost the the population of slaveholding states so that they are allowed to have a greater number of representatives in Congress, in the National Congress. So, as the country expanded westward, as I mentioned a few moments ago in the last segment, the expansion of slavery is going to move with that westward expansion. And it's going to become an increasingly contentious issue as a result, as there's this effort to maintain the delicate equilibrium between slave states and free states. And it would lead to a host of different political compromises, which would ultimately result in collapse. The first of these, the first notable example, comes in 1820 with what's known as the Missouri Compromise, which reserved a majority of the Louisiana Territory um, for free states. And you can see that the southern border of Missouri that was uh, had offered up its application, you might say, to become a full-fledged state within the United States. Um, the southern border of that state was going to serve as the line by which the remaining territory, unorganized territory of the Louisiana Purchase, would be reserved for um, the creation of future free states. Slave states were only relegated to the area south of that southern border. Um, and of course, it only applied to the remaining territory of the Louisiana Territory itself. This land was in 1820 not part of the United States. So again, that changes. By 1845, Texas becomes a state, a slave state. Um, by 1850, you have the Compromise of 1850, which resulted in California becoming a free state. Again, gold being discovered meant that there was this massive gold rush that took place, and people flocked to the western coast. When the population reached 60,000 people, California, the territory of California, was eligible to apply for statehood, which it did. In 1850, the Compromise of 1850 admitted California as a free state, but it allowed for the concept of popular sovereignty to take effect, which would allow settlers in territories to decide on whether their territory, when it came time to become a state, would be admitted as a free or a slave state. Um, so what that meant is that it nullified the terms of the Missouri Compromise in places like, instead of halting slavery north of this line, instead these potential states in all the remaining unorganized areas of the continental U.S. now could decide for themselves. The population living in those territories could decide for themselves whether they wanted to be free or slave states. The Missouri Compromise of 1850 also outlawed slavery within the District of Columbia, and it also strengthened the fugitive slave law so that any slaves that made their way from a slave state to a free state could be, seized and returned to the their owners in the slave states in the South. Those laws have been on the books, but they weren't very well enforced. The Compromise of 1850 makes for stronger enforcement of that. Just 4 years after that, in the Kansas Nebraska Act of 1854, popular sovereignty established under the Compromise of 1850 was put to the test, and would be applied, as I said, to territories within the Louisiana Territory itself. So what we see here, I mean, just by the timeline itself, is a shorter lifespan and shelf life for these compromises. That they're becoming much less resilient. They're becoming much more kind of addressing more and more micro type of issues and potential points of conflict. In more and more specific instances. And it was a sign of the untenable nature of the dichotomy of American life between free states and slave states. Lincoln characterized this as a house divided in one of his campaigning speeches. Um, it could also be seen in American politics. That there was the cultivation of a Southern identity and notions of a Southern sense of nationalism as well. Meanwhile, conversely, you had the creation of new third parties, such as the Free Soil Party, which called for a full stop to slavery's expansion in any remaining territory and any remaining unclaimed lands of the falling under the jurisdiction of the United States. Lincoln himself was a member of the Free Soil Party before he became a member of the Republican Party, which was established in the 1850s. There was also the Convention of Seneca Falls in 1848, in which you have, as I mentioned, with the kind of the reform era, the reform movements that were taking place. Um, the Falls Convention was going to be convened in order to align the emancipation movement and the abolition of slavery with the women's rights movement. So there's an effort to fuse various interests of reform efforts along racial and gender lines in order to get them aligned for the same agenda. You know, that they all wanted greater freedom in the public sphere. Well, you know, um, that works on paper, but how women are to achieve that and how African Americans are to achieve that may be very different experiences and very different routes that have to be taken. Um, and this is going to, in many cases, serve as where where the these reform movements are going to butt up against each other, um, and serve to split and fracture reform movements, so that they're competing with each other in some respects for the public's attention and bringing attention to their own individual plight. All of this is going to help us get into, of course, when it comes to the issue of slavery, the Civil War itself from 1861 to 1865. The two key turning points, I'm sure we're well versed in the Civil War. The two key turning points here are one on the kind of international realm or arena, the Battle of Antietam in 1862. As a result of that stalemate, in which Confederate army is forced to retreat and basically move back across the Potomac into areas of Virginia. And the Union Army is, at the very least, successful in stopping Lee from invading into, border states and trying to march even farther north to bring the war to the Northerners themselves. When news of that begins to spread around the world, primarily Europe, foreign powers begin to reject the recognition of the Confederate States of America and their right to independence, which was a big deal. When you're fighting for independence, one of the absolute necessary ingredients is recognition of your independence by others. It's one reason why the American Revolution was successful, because you had powers like France recognizing and drafting treaties with the Continental Congress and with the American independent movement and the American government during that time, which recognized, you know, in which they recognized legitimacy, the right to exist in the states of the world. The Confederate States of America, largely as a result of the outcome at the Battle of Antietam, did not. And so this meant that the Confederacy was really at a loss, because it wasn't gaining that sense of legitimacy and recognition. And also, of course, as after the Battle of Antietam, President Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, which fundamentally changes the war aims of the northern states and the Union itself, making the abolition of slavery explicitly one of the um, key agendas of the northern uh, cause itself. That prior to that time, Lincoln was trying to find any combination, any way in which compromise could be achieved, whether it would mean, as he put it, the freeing of all the slaves, some of the slaves, or none of the slaves. Well, after 1862, when the proclamation said that after January 1st of 1863, uh, Lincoln is saying the uh, you know um, Policy of the federal government moving forward is going to be one of the abolition of slavery in areas of the Confederacy that remained in rebellion by January 1, 1863. So he's basically